I love taking the train. It's maybe my favorite form of transportation. And recently I was planning a trip that was close enough to me that it was kind of a toss up. Should I take the train or should I drive my car? Now, if I take the train, I don't have to pay attention, right? I can read a book or listen to music, maybe sleep if it's an early train ride, or maybe get some work done. But the train ride was more than double the amount of time it would take for me to just drive, assuming I don't hit some aggressive traffic. I'd also have to switch trains at some point. So I was really weighing the costs between, do I do this in a shorter straight shot, or do I do it in a longer time where I'll have the full time to myself without really paying attention? And ultimately, I made the decision to drive. It's more convenient. I'm in control. It's going to cost me less money, and I can basically leave whenever I want, and I'm not really losing those extra hours, right? I'm going to drive. I could probably listen to a podcast or an audiobook, and then I will have that extra time back at my destination, right? So, as I weighed the pros and cons, I thought about how public transportation versus using your own transportation is a lot like publishing versus self-publishing. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to thank Lulu for sponsoring this video. You'll hear about them more at the end when it becomes very relevant why we should be talking about them. But I have both traditionally published books and self-published books, and I've got to say, there are a lot of pros and cons to each, and I want to go through some of them with you to help you make an informed decision. So let's dive into it. First, I'm going to talk about traditional publishing, the pros and cons there. Then I'm going to talk about the self-publishing pros and cons, and why the self-publishing pros and cons might not be the cons that we think they are. Let's dive into it. Okay, so first, traditional publishing. Let's look at the pros. First, they do all the printing and distribution for you. All you really need to do is write the book, and in the case of textbooks or instructional books, come up with the graphics. My books have all been code-based books, so I have written a bunch of code to go along with my books, as well as providing screenshots. But they provide everything else, right? They do the printing and distributing. They provide the editors, right? So they asked me if there was an editor that I wanted to work with, but the editors are on their payroll. And in my case, it was 2 copy editors, a layout editor, and a technical editor to make sure that what I was saying was technically correct. They also provide stock assets if I need them. They help promote the book, kinda. We'll talk about that later. And you usually get an advance, so you are paid upfront for your work. This is great if you maybe don't necessarily have the bandwidth to write your own book while also setting time aside to do like paid work, right? If your book is a side hustle, it's kind of nice to get paid upfront. Now, there are some cons to traditional publishing. Yes, they foot the bill for all of the production, publishing, and distribution, but there are some things that are expected of you and some things that you should know about, right? The first is that they expect you to bring the audience. When you submit a proposal to a traditional publishing company, they're going to ask you, how big is your audience and how are you going to promote the book? They're working with dozens or more authors, and so they're not going to put together a specific PR plan for you. They may email their list. Maybe they'll put out some announcement somewhere else. Maybe they'll have you write a blog post, right? My publisher has paid me to write blog posts related to the book where they promote the book. But by and large, the promotion is going to be on you. You need to bring the audience. You need to promote the book. And if your audience isn't big enough, the traditional publisher, may decide that it's too risky for you to write the book. So this is something, or for them to publish the book, right? This is something that you need to consider. The book writing process is great, but you need to already have an audience and bring them, right? You need to make sure the publisher wants to make sure that you have people ready and willing to buy your book from you. By and large, this is the case. But along with that, you don't get any customer data. So you bring the audience, but you don't know what percentage of that audience is buying, right? Now, you could set up a pre-sale list while you're writing the book, and those people might sign up. But again, you don't know who's making the purchase. This is why you see in a lot of nonfiction books an email opt-in page to get more resources, because that's the only way the author will know who is buying the book and how they can reach directly out to the person or the people who are buying the book. So that's another consideration that you need to make. Along with that, you may not see any more money from sales. In my experience, this is anecdotal, but I've spoken to other authors about it. The advance is all they see, especially if their book is really niche. I've been writing books for 12 years through traditional publishers, and the first royalty check I've seen came this year. Again, 12 years after I started writing traditionally published books. And that book, by and large, has had more mass appeal. It was a more general development book that can be used in the classroom. It also has a longer shelf life than some of the other things I wrote. So this is something to consider. The advance may be the only money you see, depending on your audience size and how well your book sells over time. But if you're writing for royalties, or if you're writing to make money, royalties may not be the steadiest form of income. They also own the rights to the content, right? They're fronting all the money. They're making it so all you really need to do is write and promote. And because of that, they're going to own that book, that content. I have a couple of books that are no longer in distribution. And at one point, I asked the publisher if they were willing to give the rights back to me so that I could maybe self-publish. And that conversation didn't go anywhere. And I understand why. It's their content and it's their library. And that's part of the contract I signed. I only wanted to write the book at that time, and so I was willing to sign away that content. And on that same token, there may be non-compete clauses or restrictions on who else you can create similar content for. So if I write a book about how to grow the perfect apple tree, I may not be able to create an online course for somebody else on how to grow the perfect apple tree. That's also something to consider. You don't own the content, and there may be non-compete clauses. And all of that's negotiable, right? There was a stronger one in my last contract that I got them to relax because the content was general, or because the subject matter was more general, and I felt a little bit handcuffed. But these are all things to consider if you go the traditional publishing route. You get the convenience of only having to write, just like if you do public transportation, you get the convenience of not having to think about the drive or think about the travel. You're just sitting as a passenger, but you're also giving up some freedom. You don't get customer data. You don't keep the rights to the book, and there may be non-compete clauses, right? You are on the train's schedule and you are on the publisher's terms. Now, if we look at self-publishing, some of the pros are you control the entire process. Right? So there are books I've written that have gone through heavy edits because they weren't in the style or necessarily the voice that the publisher wanted, versus the self-published books that I've done where it sounds exactly like me, because that's the kind of book I wanted to write. And yes, I hired an editor, but there wasn't like, this isn't in our style, right? There wasn't that kind of mental overhead. Also, you own the work, right? You're creating it. It is yours. You're not signing the rights over to anybody. It's yours to do whatever you want with it. You get all the money from sales, right? There's no terms where you get a certain amount paid against royalties. You get to keep everything, and you get the customer data. So you know who is buying your book. and you can reach out to them and you can offer bonuses to them and you can contact them and get real feedback. It's wonderful. Those are some pretty strong pros. Now, on the other side of it, there are some cons. All of the cost of production will be on you. You're going to need to hire an editor. You're going to need to hire a graphic designer. You may need to hire somebody to lay the book out in the right way. You're also responsible for all the promotion, which you kind of are anyway, but you're probably not going to get your book into bookstores because traditional publishers have that relationship where you probably don't, or you might not. You won't get paid up front necessarily. There's a strong asterisk on that we'll talk about later. And you'll need to sell and distribute the book. You're going to need to do something where you handle the orders and all of the logistics around it. And my friends, let me tell you, that was my least favorite part of the self-publishing process, because I pre-sold the book, which means I ordered a bunch. I had them mailed to my house, and then I ended up sending them out to people all over the world. And so you got to consider packaging and shipping costs and a whole bunch of other logistical stuff. Now, luckily, I didn't sell hundreds and hundreds of copies, at least physical copies. I sold a bunch of digital copies, but that was maybe the biggest pain for me, is the fact that I had to sell and distribute the book myself. But there were some benefits for that. So let's have some real talk here. The cons of self-publishing are way easier to overcome than the cons of traditional publishing, right? You don't own the rights to your book. There's nothing you signed that contract, right? There's nothing you could do about that unless you have someone benevolent at the company who is willing to give those rights back to you. But those rights probably aren't worth much if that happens, right? Or you have a really good negotiator on your side, or you are a really good negotiator. I'm not saying it can't happen, but it might not happen, right? So that's one thing, right? And then customer data, they're not going to give you the customer data. That's gold to them that they get to keep. So the cons of self-publishing are way easier to overcome than the cons of traditional publishing. Let's walk through some of them. First of all, you're responsible for all the promotion. We've already talked about this. Even in traditional publishing, you're going to be responsible for 99.9% of the promotion. Yeah, if you really want your book in a bookstore, you're going to have to talk to an indie bookstore, or you're going to have to go with a traditional publisher who has relationships and logistics to get your book into bookstores. Everything else is going to be on you to pre-sell or pre-hype at least and promote the book. And you can, as far as I know, this may no longer be the case, but when I was publishing traditional books, I always had the option to buy a bunch at an author's rate and then sell them, for some extra profit. But I don't know, that's going to depend on the publisher and things like that. So you're responsible for all the promotion on that end. You won't get paid up front. This could be true, right? If you go the self-publishing route and you just want to write the book, you won't get paid up front. However, over on Lulu's blog, I outlined how my last self-published book was funded through crowdfunding, right? This is a very common thing that you see on Kickstarter and Indiegogo and other places like that, where you need to prove you have an audience anyway, right? And it's good to prove the proof of concept, or to prove the concept, I guess, before you write the book, right? If nobody wants to buy it, then maybe you don't want to write the book, right? So you could get paid up front through a crowdfunding campaign or a sponsor. I had a couple of big sponsors in my last book where I put their logo in the book and I thanked them for their support, for making the book happen. That's something that you could consider if you want to get some money up front for the book. That's definitely something I'm considering for my next book as well. You'll need to sell and distribute the book. This is true. This could be really hard, but that's where today's sponsor comes in. I told you a story earlier about how the fulfillment and distribution of my self-published book was an absolute nightmare. That would not have been the case if I used Lulu. Lulu is a platform that helps self-published authors publish, fulfill, distribute their book. They integrate with a bunch of e-commerce platforms like Shopify and WooCommerce, but they also have their own Lulu bookstore. And of course, they integrate with Amazon as well. And again, you can promote your book, send people to the sales page. Once the sale is made, Lulu handles everything else with their print on demand service. It could not be easier. You do the hard part, which is the writing. Lulu handles the distribution and mailings and printing and publishing for you. I'm so grateful that I've partnered with Lulu on this, and they are definitely going to have a huge hand in my next self-published book. So if you have a book inside you and you're like, hey, self-publishing really sounds like a pain, check out Lulu. They make the process painless. You can head over to podcastworkflows.com/Lulu to learn more. Thanks so much to Lulu for sponsoring this video. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you've got some good pros and cons. You know what to consider when you are going to write your next book. Maybe you want to go the traditional publishing route, or maybe you want to control the whole process, keep that customer data, and go the self-published route, which is even easier thanks to today's sponsor, Lulu. So if you have any questions about traditional versus self-publishing, definitely leave them in the comments below. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and until next time, I'll see you out there.